Our previous discussion of vagueness brings us to a very famous puzzle which arose in antiquity, namely the so-called Sorites paradox. The term Sorites, which means heap or pile in Greek, refers to a seemingly valid argument that uses a vague term in both the premises and the conclusion. While the premises seem to be true and the inference seems to be valid, the conclusion nonetheless appears to be preposterous. Many paradoxes involve vagueness and begin with seemingly true premises that lead to a ridiculous conclusion. Take the following example. Premise 1, 1 grain of sand is not a heap. Premise 2, if 1 grain is not a heap, then an additional grain will still not make a heap. Premise 3, if 2 grains aren't a heap, then the addition of yet another grain won't suffice to make a heap, and so on. We get to the point where, no matter how many grains of sand we have, they still are not a heap, and the addition of one more grain won't suffice to produce one. The conclusion is that, no matter how many grains of sand we have, we can't get to a heap, and this is clearly ridiculous. This paradox is troubling for several reasons. The argument seems valid, the premises seem true, and yet the conclusion seems to be false. But if the premises are true and the inference is valid, how can the conclusion be false? Yet it surely is. This brings on the paradox. Something is clearly amiss among the statements that make up the argument, but we can't quickly ascertain what it is. So what precisely do we mean by a paradox? It's a logical puzzle without apparent solution. It seems to have premises and a conclusion that, taken independently, all seem true, yet taken together can't all be true. Usually, logicians tackle paradoxes in one of two ways. They either solve them or they dissolve them. To solve a paradox, you have to show that at least one of its claims is false. To dissolve a paradox, you need to show that the claims aren't really inconsistent, which means that they don't contradict one another. Here's another example of a Sorites. Imagine the following argument. Someone says, would you describe a man with 1 hair on his head as bald? Yeah, sure. Would you describe a man with 2 hairs on his head as bald? Yes. 3 hairs? Yes. 4? Of course. But if a man has 10,000 hairs on his head, you wouldn't call him bald, but where do you draw the line? Which added hair makes a man no longer bald? You've noticed that these paradoxes both proceed by addition, but we could easily imagine them going in the opposite direction, by subtraction. We also note that Sorites' arguments seem to pair opposites such as heap and non-heap, bald and hirsute, which means hairy, poor and rich, etc. For every Sorites that proceeds by addition, there's a reverse argument that proceeds by subtraction. This concludes this segment of a multi-part lecture on fallacies of unclear language. Please proceed to the next segment.